This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi. In Manila is Professor J.L. Batongbacal. He has been a former legal advisor for the Philippines delegation, which successfully pursued a continental shelf claim. He's currently the director of the Institute for Maritime Affairs and Sea Law and the executive associate dean at the Philippine University College of Law. Professor Batongbacal, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me.
Professor, just what's happening at the Whitsun or the Javier Reef, as you call it, over the last month and even before that? Could you explain for people who are not really familiar with the situation, what's really happening with 200 plus 220 Chinese so-called fishing vessels, which are said to be maritime militia personnel on board? What are they doing in that area?
Well, just over the weekend, the Philippine government revealed that a photograph or some photographs taken on March 7 showed 220 Chinese vessels massed at Whitsun Reef, which is within the Spratly Islands. It is part of a large feature known as Union Banks. It's roughly in the middle of the Spratly Island group. These 220 vessels were noted to be of a certain type. They were called maritime militia vessels, no? And even though they were fishing vessels, the design and their appearance appeared to be fishing vessels, they were observed to be not doing any fishing at all for all of the time that they've been there. They were just stationary at Whitsun Reef. And so finding 220 of these maritime militia vessels raised concerns within the Philippine government that they might be preparing for some kind of action. And so when it was revealed to the press, of course, a huge public uproar resulted. And the Philippine Air Force sent surveillance flights to the reef, and they confirmed that most of the vessels were still there. They counted about 180 about 2 days later. So they had actually been there for 2 weeks at least, no? And then later on, information came out that these vessels were actually massing in that reef since November or December last year. Now, the Secretary of Defense issued a call for the vessels to be withdrawn, and this was followed by a diplomatic protest from the Department of Foreign Affairs. And since that time, all eyes have been on that reef, and other countries such as the U.S. And Japan and other nations issued statements in support of the Philippines, demanding that this entire fishing fleet or maritime militia fleet be withdrawn from the reef. So as of today, we had another surveillance flight, and it showed that most of the vessels were still there.
Right. So what is, in the Philippines' view, the Chinese game plan? Because they certainly seem to have one, considering how they have done the same thing in the past in the South China Sea.
Yes, the real issue here, or the concern that is raised in government, is that this might be preparatory to the occupation or the taking of the reef, because it is very similar to what happened before to the Philippines with respect to Mischief Reef and Scarborough Shoal. In both of those instances, the first step really taken by the Chinese was to send their fishermen. And then after their fishermen established a more or less continuing presence there, they took steps to either occupy the feature, like what they did in Mischief Reef, or to begin shooing away Filipino fishermen. And so this sort of reminded the government that these previous events are also taking place again. So they're concerned that they're preparing to also now take Whitsun Reef. So this has been a pattern really of the Chinese fishermen and Coast Guard and Navy of how they've been slowly taking over features in the South China Sea.
Right. So apart from surveillance, you mentioned aircraft have been flying over. Both the Navy and the Coast Guard have said that vessels will be in the area as well. Diplomatic protests, verb notals. Apart from that, what can the Philippines do, despite what Secretary Blinken says that the US will stand by its treaty ally?
Well, of course, this is all necessary. The Philippines has only diplomacy as its option right now because these are still ostensibly fishing vessels, private fishing vessels, even though they've been observed to be acting more as maritime militia. But they have not yet taken any aggressive action. There is no provocation yet other than their presence en masse. So it can still be resolved diplomatically if the Chinese were to withdraw from the reef. And I think that's what the government really is trying to do now. Fortunately, the statements of support from the international community appear to have strengthened the hand of the government in facing up to the Chinese side this time.
Now, this is despite the fact that you were also a legal advisor for the Philippine side that was successful in establishing, its maritime claim, the EEZ, despite the fact that the Whitsun Reef, or the Julian Felipe Reef, as the Philippines calls it, is within the EEZ. You have a ruling from the PCA in The Hague in the past as well, which really hasn't been, the Chinese, of course, don't accept that, but they're part of UNCLOS, right? So how do all that, what's the politics behind that? Philippines doesn't seem to be pushing its international legal claim that has been upheld in the
Yes. Well, even though the Philippines won its case in 2016, and vindicated its rights to its exclusive economic zone and continental shelf, the current administration chose a different path, a totally different path from what was pursued by the previous Aquino administration. So the Aquino administration was able to see the litigation through, but the Duterte administration did not press its implementation. It instead chose to pursue a very friendly and accommodating posture vis-a-vis China, hoping that would create generosity on the part of the Chinese side, and that China would then provide infrastructure and financial aid to the Philippines. 4 or 5 years down the road, unfortunately, none of the promises that China made to President Duterte in its initial 1 or 2 years, none of them have really come to fruition. Only a couple of bridges, but none of the really big ticket items. So I think that has played a part as well. This dissatisfaction, I guess, in the position vis-a-vis China, and that probably is why there is this change in the posture of the Philippines and dealing with China this time. Unlike before, it would always downplay events, but now this has been a really controversial incident, and even the government, especially through DFA and the Department of Defense, they've issued very strongly worded statements this time.
Right, the Secretary of Defense you're mentioning there, who issued a statement, then Secretary of Foreign Affairs, the department as well, Teddy Locsin, and his tweets we've seen over the last month or so. But President Duterte himself apparently spoke to the Chinese ambassador, and he was assured that there was nothing amiss. But does he now see a pattern? Does the government see a pattern in terms of promises not being kept, as you mentioned? So the policy that they followed seems to have backfired in a way with China.
Well, one hopes that he realizes that, of course. He has actually been relatively silent, other than the news that came out that he spoke with the Chinese ambassador, where he supposedly said that he was concerned about the vessels massed there. No other statement has actually been made by the president himself. It's really been the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Foreign Affairs who have been doing that for him.
Now, explain to us, Professor, the Mutual Defense Treaty with the U.S., which calls for the U.S. to step up if there's any conflict or otherwise.
Yes.
Do you first of all visualize any incident taking place, even by accident or because of its incremental, upping of the ante from both sides, and how do you see the U.S. reacting?
Well, the United States has been the oldest treaty ally and the only treaty ally of the Philippines so far. Under the Mutual Defense Treaty, the U.S. committed.
Asian ally, as I think Secretary Blinken put.
Yes. Under the MDT, the U.S. has committed, and it has actually explained it to the Philippines many times over the years, that they will respond if any public ship or aircraft or troops of the Philippines are subject to an attack anywhere in the Pacific area, which they clarified further to include the South China Sea. So they made it a point to again restate that position. And when this controversy blew up over the weekend, there was an immediate statement again from the United States through its embassy that they were standing by their treaty ally. Now, this is very important because yes, the possibility of an incident is of course there, given that China has continued to incrementally acquire portions of what we call the West Philippine Sea, which is actually our exclusive economic zone and continental shelf, as part of their overall attempt to try to take control of the South China Sea and all of the island groups there. So the assurance by the United States, I think, lends some strength, not just support, to the Philippine side, so that its units like the Philippine Coast Guard vessels and the Armed Forces vessels and aircraft can move in the area and at least conduct surveillance activities and patrols, so that will give them better maritime domain awareness, a better sense of what the Chinese are doing this time in that area.
Right, you're mentioning that these are under the guise of fishing vessels, but the recently passed Coast Guard law that China passed and came into effect on the 1st of February, is that worrying if it escalates from the guise of fishing vessels, because they are then allowed to fire at sea?
Well, it is of course a concern. The fishing vessels of China do not have that authority, even though they are known to be part of the maritime militia. The law that China passed refers specifically to their Coast Guard. Now, we have not cited, or there have been at least no reports of the sighting of any Chinese Coast Guard vessels accompanying these maritime militia vessels or fishing vessels that were sighted on Whitsun Reef. But definitely they are in the area because they're often observed patrolling or moving, especially between the artificial islands that China created. So even if you don't see them there, they're probably just over the horizon. It is a concern, of course, because this new Coast Guard law of China expressly authorizes them to use force to expel foreigners, to enforce the Chinese maritime law, to remove structures that they deem to be illegal in areas that they claim to be waters under their jurisdiction. It would be fine if they limited themselves to only their jurisdictional waters within 200 miles from the Chinese coast, for example, in accordance with UNCLOS. But the problem is, since 2014, China Coast Guard vessels have been undertaking enforcement actions or actions against Philippine fishermen, Philippine vessels within the exclusive economic zone, sometimes within 100 nautical miles from the Philippine coast. So there is that prior experience. There are those prior experiences that inform the Philippines' concerns, their worries that in the future, China will use its Coast Guard vessels to take actions against Philippine vessels and even aircraft within its own within Philippine jurisdiction, and that is really that could be considered as an act of aggression.
Right. When you're talking about acts of aggression, you mentioned the DMT and the US. Now, President Duterte is seen as playing China and the US. There was a flip-flop about the forces agreement as well. Then him asking the US to pay. Is everything okay in that relationship, the allies between the US and the Philippines now?
Well, actually, I am also not so sure because as of today, there has been no statement from the government indicating that they are resuming the visiting forces agreement. If you recall, last year, President Duterte suddenly announced that he was abrogating it. And then they stepped back from that decision and suspended the abrogation for 6 months. And then after, well, close to the end of that 6-month period, they again suspended the abrogation. So it is still, that clock is still ticking. And so this crisis or controversy coming at this time, no, I'm sure is going to again get discussions and debates going within the government, and especially with President Duterte himself, no, as to the wisdom of his rather rash decision to abrogate the Visiting Forces Agreement, which is really the main instrument by which the Mutual Defense Treaty is being implemented at present.
So, Professor Batongbacal, Philippines and the other Southeast Asian countries and Japan, if you include as well, is there a difference in the way China is now seen because of Chinese behavior, whether it's in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea? We've seen on territory, on Indian territory as well in Ladakh, Indonesia, and I think it is Japan who said that they will conduct naval exercises and nothing should be changed in response to what's happening. I'm sure the Americans will also have a fleet of their carrier group show force. But within ASEAN, is there an understanding of the only way to deal with China is if everyone is together?
Well, unfortunately, even though there has been a change in the perceptions of China, it has not yet reached the point where the ASEAN countries are able to really get past their individual differences and come up with a united front. No? There are signs that that is coming, but probably that's still in the future. Right now, certainly there has been a loss of trust and there has been suspicions raised because of all the activities that China carried out against the Southeast Asian claimants, especially in the last year or 2 years. No, it has taken actions against Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia, for example, and that has, I'm sure, that has raised concerns and has resulted in the code of conduct negotiations with China being slowing down because of that. No. Right now, the concern is that the actions being taken by China, in a way, are preempting the results of these code of conduct discussions. The code of conduct discussions themselves have been delayed by the pandemic, no? But this generated the loss of trust, I think, has slowed down the process even more. But again, like I said, no, that hasn't resulted yet in an express and really unified position within ASEAN. Although we've seen some movements towards some kind of alignment, especially when it comes to the application of UNCLOS in the South China Sea and the entitlements of the Southeast Asian countries to their own exclusive economic zones and continental shelves, most of which China also claims.
So China has been known to drive a wedge between ASEAN countries in the past, but now with the State Councillor, Foreign Minister Wang inviting a select group of Southeast Asian nations, including Philippines and Indonesia, Singapore, I believe, for a 2-day visit to China. Do you see the latest problem being sorted out diplomatically, or is this just another step in what we know China's direction which they've decided to go at?
I think that it is in China's interest to sort this particular incident out diplomatically and to be able to present a kind of win, to present itself as being reasonable and able to withdraw from this situation. However, that should not make us all complacent, because, again, this is only a small part of a longer-term plan or strategy on the part of China. Even if they ease off now, they may again bear down on us in the future. And that has already happened before, especially in our experiences with respect to mischief reef, where initially we had a negotiated modus vivendi, and then that was subsequently violated some years down the road. And now what we have on Mischief Reef is the largest artificial island in the Spratlys, and it's also the closest to the Philippines, and it's hosting a full-blown military base. So we should not be complacent, even if the situation seems to be resolved for now. at the diplomatic conference that they will have, I expect that China will try to placate essentially Southeast Asia and try to keep on good terms with them, especially since China is increasingly at odds with the United States, no, and they're really competing for influence over this region.
Professor J.L. Batongbacal, thank you so much for your experience and your expertise, and thank you for appearing on StratNews Global.
Welcome, Amitabh.
Just a reminder that if you want to get notifications for videos like this one, just click on the bell icon on our YouTube channel. Do follow our social media handles as well on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to get the latest news, updates, and analysis of events across the globe from an Indian perspective. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.